Jason McCreary, he goes by JMAC. He's the creator of Laravel Shift, which is an automated Laravel upgrade service. It upgrades your Laravel application for you. Please give a big welcome to JMAC.
Thanks, man. All right, thank you, Justin. First, let's make sure if this clicker works. Yes, okay, good. Everybody hear me okay? All right. Oh no, I don't have my presenter notes over here. Okay, maybe I won't stray too far. Okay, this is Laravel by the numbers. I am JMAC. I spoke at Laracon about 2 years ago when it was in Louisville, which is where I'm from, so that was really awesome. It was also a talk that I was very proud of, and if you attended it, you know that JMAC is an acronym, which is an abbreviation for my name, Jason McCreary. The last time I spoke was about Yagni, and again, I was really proud of that talk, and so when Taylor asked me to speak again at Laracon, I wanted to do an evolution of this talk, but I kind of started looking at the speakers and the talks that everyone else was going to do, and I saw that Adam had a great talk this morning on resisting complexity, so I thought, well, okay, that's bordering the line there. And then I also saw that Uncle Bob is talking tomorrow on clean code, the original clean coder, so I didn't really want to get in that road. So I really started thinking, like, what is something that I can talk about that's very unique to me, like something that maybe some insight that I have? Because most of the time, aside from right now, I'm an attendee, and I don't necessarily want to see the same topic at a single-track conference. I want to, get some diversity and learn new things. So I started thinking, okay, well, what is this unique thing I can talk about? And of course, I landed on Shift. For those that aren't familiar, I'm the creator of Laravel Shift. As Justin said, it upgrades your application code for you automatically between all the awesome Laravel versions that are coming out every 6 months. It helps you keep up. Hopefully a few of you have heard of this service. I'm not sure, but the numbers say that you have, so maybe there's a few woos out there. I don't necessarily, yeah, okay, good, good, thank you. I was feeling so lonely for a second. But I actually have the data, so I know that some of you are using this. So, and that's really what I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about Shift necessarily as the service. I want to talk about the data behind Shift. That's what I'm really excited about. So this is, like I said, Laravel by the numbers. I'm going to mix all that together. I'm going to mix complexity and clean code and how we might be able to write some code that's a little bit better and back it up with the data that comes from Shift. I don't know if anybody gets that reference, but there was a show called Numbers, and they put a 3 in it. It was like early 2000s, so maybe I'm too old. But then we could, just go super geek and do leet speak, right? So that seemed super complex to me, though, so I didn't really want to do that. But anyways, I'm a programmer. I'm not really a data scientist, so I put my data scientist hat on, which is also my snowboarding helmet, which actually now I realize kind of looks like Cerebro. And I started typing, and I ended up, of course, on Stack Overflow, where everybody's like, hey, you need Hadoop, and use R, and get Python, and learn everything. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so complex. I practice Yagni, and so I had a beer, and just kind of like toned it all down and started making some of my own kind of personal observations about things. And what I realized is Adam Wadman has a very specific stage uniform that he wears. It's very stylish, and I was so nervous that he was going to change that this morning, but he perfectly wore exactly what I wanted and confirmed last night at the speaker dinner, so I was like, phew, the joke will work. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Adam. Also, David Hemphill has an excellent blue steel when he hangs from the rafters. But he actually more closely resembles the Punisher from Netflix, which is fucking badass. So that's awesome. And another observation was, with a hat and no goatee, Taylor Otwell looks like he's going to join the other kids at space camp. So I hope he doesn't forget his awesome Nova lunchbox. Okay, so those are ridiculous observations that made me stop drinking. And so I realized I better go back and just talk about Shift. So with Shift, there are 8,470 Laravel projects that have been upgraded by Shift. So that's the data that we're going to be talking about. Thank you. So these are strictly Laravel versions. They don't necessarily include any of the PHP shifts, so these are the hardcore numbers here. And just for a couple more quick stats on Shift, and then we're going to get into the data, just kind of the growth, we can see the little spikes that happen. These are actually correlated nicely with the release cycles. We also see kind of shifts by version, right? So I'll talk more about what this means here in a little bit, kind of analyze that data, but information here. And what we see is each one of those little blips is about a 46% growth rate. So that's super nice. So it's getting adopted. As I said, I knew that people were using it, so I'm glad you all kind of chimed in. But what I'm really proud of as far as Shift, the last metric, is the retention rate. So if someone uses Shift, they're going to use it again. 93% of the time, they use it again. I guess the other 7% are the people that send me hate emails that I applied PSR2 to their code base. I'm really sorry. I always apologize and tell them how to use git revert, but apparently they have left. But otherwise, everyone uses it again. So I'm very proud of that, very proud of the service, and I'm going to continue to keep working on it. So that's it about Shift. What I want to talk about now is the data around Shift. And so what this data is that each time a shift runs, I create a log file. And a log file sits in this location, and I actually wanted to do a really cool animation where I ran that command and it like scrolled, but there were 8,470 in there, and it actually broke Keynote, so this is just a screenshot, I'm sorry. But what's more important than all of these shift logs is what's inside of them, right? So originally these were really debug logs. These are debug logs for me to track the service and try to improve it and learn things. So I have information about what version of Shift run, which is really just the hash of the commit. It has little ancillary kind of lifecycle information like it cloning the project. And then specifically whatever's run, I get kind of just little string event logs. There's absolutely no code that goes in these log files. There's no secret keys or tokens. I don't keep any of that, okay? This is strictly just little bits of debugging information. But if we look through it, there's actually some things that we can kind of start to infer from simply even this debugging information. So I can see what was upgraded, what was not upgraded, exactly what files couldn't be upgraded. And again, these are things that help me kind of tweak it. I can get information about packages. I kind of see features that I should or should not pay attention to in future versions of Shift. So for example, this customized namespace. Also just kind of generally how long it took to run. So I gathered all this up and I tied it all together, and what I came up with was about 20 metrics that I want to share with you guys. In fact, I was in the back and putting even more in there, and just I really got that data science hat on, and I was really tackling it. So there's probably more like 24 or 25. I honestly didn't run through all of these, so I apologize if I don't know what metric is next, but I guarantee you we'll be able to talk about it. And I do want to leave time for questions at the end. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick so we can get to those questions, because I'm excited to answer those. So this first part are really analytics. I try not to do any kind of inference or insight here. I really just want to present the data in this first section. There's 3 sections. So what is the most popular version? So we saw this from the graph before. So it's Laravel 5.3. So Laravel 5.3 in the wild is the most popular version. And this actually tracks pretty well, and I think because of the reasons behind this are the PHP version requirements that change between 5.3 and 5.4, the testing, underlying testing framework change between 5.3 and 5.4, as well as some of the auth components. I think some of these reasons keep people on 5.3. But actually, if we think about it, Shift is an upgrade service. So if 5.3 is the most popular Shift, then that means technically 5.4 or 5.5 is actually the most popular version. So 5.5, I believe, is the version, according to Shift, that is the most popular. And this also is in line with that 46% adoption rate that we saw earlier. Not too many people jump to the right version. I guess less than half, technically, jump to the very latest version. So 5.5 is the most popular still. Okay, most popular packages. So these are things inside of require and require dev. So outside of the core packages that are included, so of course the framework is 100%, but if you drop some of those out, the first things that we get are Guzzle. We get Predis, we get the Laravel Collective, all sorts of different things. We start to see as we go down the list more of Laravel's packages, right? We see a lot of the Spatie packages. I hope I said that right. Did I? Yes, good, thank you. All right, so we see those. If we keep going, I kind of cut it off at 10% because things got a little squirrely from there. So again, we see kind of more of those third-party packages as we move down the line. So we see some stuff from Algolia. We see some stuff from Stripe, right? So those are all of the production packages. As far as the dev packages, pretty standard. The stuff from Barry, the debug bar, the IDE helper, and then the testing frameworks. Although we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I think the Symfony stuff, obviously Symfony Thanks is kind of more of a marketing thing. And then the DOM crawler and the selector, in my opinion, are probably just legacy from earlier versions. All right, what's the most changed file? Well, in this case, it's most changed files. It's everything in the config folder, as we would expect, right? These are the files that people are having to change in between versions, specifically database, mail, services, auth, and session. These are the top 5 in that order. But just to take a little tangent here, because from my perspective as the creator of Shift, it's a failure on my part if I can't upgrade something for you automatically. And as much as I know that you all, the users, you love all those PR comments and kind of just going through them yourself, I still want to be able to do it for you. So let me take a quick tangent and make some suggestions on how you might be able to get around this being the most changed file. So what I see a lot is actually people overriding those values directly in the config file, and that's fine. You can do that. But we have these env variables that you should be doing that through, especially in this case, right? So instead of overriding these with Shift and Laravel Shift, obviously I can leave them default and leverage the env variable. So super simple in this case. In cases that you have a lot of your own custom configuration, again, I know you can put it in an app, but maybe consider putting it somewhere else. Maybe consider creating your own core file, a settings file, or if you want something more domain specific, in my case, I have a Shift config file, right? And inside there, I just have some stuff, just like any other config file. But instead of cluttering up, services or something else or app, even though those things are readily changeable, this just makes life a little bit easier. It kind of puts things under that domain-specific kind of umbrella, and it keeps the upgrade nice and smooth for me. So if this is something that's going to be upgraded all the time anyways, why not just adopt a couple of these little tricks to, again, save yourself some time? If you absolutely must, so for example, application time zone, I actually had a need to change this. If you must, I encourage you to just jump ahead and create an env variable out of that, so you can leave the default value as a reference. So the default value in this case coming from the Laravel config, but then you can configure it through that environment variable. I actually thought this was super awesome, and I made a pull request, and Graham closed it in like 13 seconds. But to be fair, he referenced like the 42 other times someone tried to PR this. So yeah, apparently that's not a welcome change. Okay, so another piece of analytics here is custom namespace, or what I kind of consider a vanity namespace. And what we're talking about here is basically where people override the app namespace. So by default, this is app, but maybe I'm vain and I want to make it Shift to label all my stuff. There's not many applications that do this, 1 in 10, I guess you could say. But again, it just makes that upgrade process a little bit harder. You have to go through all of your namespaces and change them to this. You have to, if you have polymorphic relationships, you have to change them at the database, right? If you want to drop in a new file, that maybe a new middleware or a new config file or whatever that came from the framework, you have to remember to change this. And it's just an unnecessary piece of complexity. Jeffrey Way, Taylor himself have all said on Twitter over the past, several versions, just leave it app, make it simple. So if you are this 1 in 10, I encourage you to just simply run this command. It's built into Artisan, of course, and you can change it back to app. This will not pick up polymorphic relationships, so you'll need to run a query to change those in the database yourself. But I still encourage you to go back. Okay, app structure. This one's actually pretty cool. This was just run on the Laravel Analyzer in the last week, so there's really only about 400, so the sample size isn't super huge here. But what I ran was basically this find app with a max depth of 1. So this basically gets all top-level files and folders underneath the app directory. So what does this look like? So just to kind of peer inside all of these projects, of course, we see 100% for all of the core out-of-the-box folders, right? And we quickly from there start to get into more core folders, but things that are generated by artisans. So if I make an event, app make event or artisan make event, it's going to make this folder for me. Same with listeners or mail, jobs, notification. So we really don't get to custom folders until we get down to models at 36%. And we'll talk more about that in a second. What I think is interesting, though, and kind of goes a little bit to Adam's talk this morning about naming, is the first kind of non-core folder is named services. This is something, again, that I understand as developers, but it's equally tied with things like helpers. And I get it. These are common words that kind of pop up as we develop things also within Laravel. But there might be some better naming here. So I know that's a common question that comes up, like when I coach or in the Shifty Coders Slack room. A lot of people are like, where do I put this? And it seems like a lot of people start with services, but again, to Adam's talk earlier, I definitely encourage you to try to maybe find a better home for that over time, right? Another quick one I want to talk about is app helpers. App helpers is just like, it's got no home. Like, it just kind of, it doesn't belong in the app folder, in my opinion, just because of the PSR 4 namespacing, if nothing else. It just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb to me. What I've found as far as a location for helpers is Bootstrap. This is just a personal preference. There's no analytics behind this necessarily. But I like throwing in a Bootstrap. In my mind, Bootstraps are things that are essential for your application to kind of load and start up. If you don't have your helpers, your app's probably not going to run. So it seems like a good home to me. You can move that simply. Your call. Okay, so let's go back to this models folder because it was like a huge contested thing on Laravel 5 and Reddit wars everywhere about must have this models folder. So we saw that 36% of projects, so a little over a third of projects have a models folder. But just to give a little more color around that, I find that the models folder exists when there's double-digit models. So that seems to be kind of the critical mass in which, as developers, we get tired of looking at that folder and seeing all these, again, like just free-floating files out there. So greater than 11, it seemed to be the average of when people kind of jumped to that app models. That's really, again, just an extra piece of data there to help you maybe decide. Also, 100% of the time, if people were sub-namespacing their models, if they were sub-namespacing their models. So for example, if you have multiple types of users and you want to put your admin and your students and parents or people or whatever underneath that namespace, then they would definitely adopt kind of model as being that parent namespace. Okay, let's talk a little bit about code. So there's more metrics here, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the insight that kind of I've taken from these. So inserting inheritance. This is something I see a lot in Laravel. And what I'm talking about is this base controller, right? And this is actually something that truly existed in Laravel 4.2, but I'm still seeing it now, Laravel 5. Also something like base model. So we're injecting a level into the hierarchy for controllers, models, whatever, that create this separation from the framework. And of course, we're trying to put some extra things in here. This isn't super common, but it happens enough, and I think it's just an extra layer of that complexity, so I want to talk about it a little bit. Controllers, you already have a controller that you can put kind of things in. You're already extending from the controller that already exists inside of HTTP controllers. You can put things that you want here. So there's really not a very large need, in my opinion, to do a base controller. Where we see it a little more often, and I think where people have a little more of an argument, might be a model. So here's just kind of an example that was pulled. This model basically kind of just sets up some events, right? And this is what base model does. But if you actually go around and kind of look through the application a little bit more, this was actually from a coaching session, we kind of dug around to see, okay, well, how are we using this inheritance, right? So every model was extending base model, which was extending Eloquent model, and we just kind of inserted this into the hierarchy. But if you look, they actually had this attendee model that turned off all of that functionality, right? And it seems a little goofy, but this happens in the code. Like this, through inheritance, like you really have to strictly adopt that. And I think as, object-oriented, as one of the pillars of object-oriented programming, we kind of reach to it, but it might not be the right tool for the job is the point. And so in these situations, what I like to do is grok the framework. Really what this is I just don't like fighting the framework or the language. So if I don't like the way something's going, instead of just kind of forcing it in there, like this base model example, I want to kind of take a step back and adapt to the surroundings, right? I want to see what else is going on. So in the case of Laravel, like we said with the controller, we can take a look and kind of get an idea. What's Laravel doing when it wants to add in additional functionality, right? We can see some ideas maybe from the controller class. If we look at the login controller, this doesn't extend an auth controller, or at least not anymore. It has additional functionality though. And how's it doing it? It's doing it with the traits, right? And so maybe instead of forcing inheritance where it possibly doesn't fit, we can use decoration instead, right? So we can use these traits. So instead of this base model inheritance, we can toss in a trait. Now, I would encourage everyone to give it a better name. I'm not too happy with that name, but it's a start. And the point is, instead of extending that and injecting that piece into the hierarchy, that additional layer, we can go back to extending Eloquent directly, and we can decorate this additional functionality with a trait. All right, customized auth. This is huge. 80% of applications change the auth components. Now, I'm not just talking about changing the redirection URL or changing the guard in the config. They're actually like creating a different controller, like a user's controller, and they're pushing all of the auth login through there, or auth attempt is happening through there. Or they're coming into the login controller itself and then just like blanketly overriding login. And the main three reasons I see for this are when they want to add additional like criteria. So let's say you have a role or an active on your users, or you have different types of users and you need to control that somehow. Maybe you need to do something like a redirection or send an additional piece of email afterward, right? And then finally, the third example is really when you need to augment the flow in some way. So 2FA, or if you need to have a confirmation email or something along those lines to kind of authenticate and activate your account. I'll see people overriding this. But if we jump into the framework, specifically this auth users trait, we can actually kind of scroll through it, and we can see that everything's really broken out very, very well. It's nice and compartmentalized. All of these things we can go through and look at and kind of get an idea of maybe what else we could change or overwrite instead of completely overwriting login, because I promise you, as you go between the versions, that's going to become very, very painful. So for example, if we needed to augment maybe the criteria in which you log in, like add some additional things to the where clause, right? If we scroll down and we look at attempt login, same thing. We can see that it's nice and compartmentalized. We can kind of move things around. So it calls credentials, and credentials finally has a username and password. And an even username is actually something that can be configured, right? But if we needed to add active equals 1 or anything along those lines, this would be the great place to do that. If we need to do things after the authentications occurred, there's actually this authenticated method as well that we could overwrite. So instead of kind of just blanketly going in and throwing out all the great features that kind of Laravel gives you out of the box, take a second, look at some of these traits and see if there's an opportunity to just get down to kind of that really small level and change it directly instead of kind of changing the big thing. You'll save yourself some headaches. If none of those work, there are all sorts of events that can be fired. We saw this earlier in some code samples where you can fire an event to kind of have a job that gets run or a listener that runs additional like ancillary code that maybe doesn't fit somewhere else. So these are all options as well. They're all listed in the docs. There's, I think, like 7 or 8 of them. Finally, if you do overwrite one of these methods, again, nothing wrong with it, but I encourage you to tag an annotation. This is a little .NET or Java-esque. But again, as someone who's upgraded projects for people as part of the service, it's very helpful to know, especially as these methods change names over the life cycle, to know, okay, this was a core method that I overrode. So just adding this simple tag kind of helps. Okay. I have so many slides to do, and I'm already like halfway there. Okay, so global facades. I'll go through this one a little bit quicker. Global facades are basically where we reference all of the facades through the global namespace. And this is absolutely an option to do through aliases. So you can also, instead of the slash, you can do use mail. It's just not very expressive. Again, it's available through all the aliases. It allows you to kind of mess with a container and swap something out if you actually need to, but I really doubt that a majority of us are doing that. I don't have metrics on that specifically, but my guess is that we're not necessarily always swapping out the mail facade. So 73% of applications do use and reference these facades globally. So like the core facades, they're referencing it in one of those two ways. As an option, I think I like explicitly referencing these. I lose a little bit from the container possibly, but it's just a little more explicit to me. It's a little more clear about what's happening, and it definitely helps other developers, especially if you have new people on the team. You can also, I've seen kind of a movement inside of the framework to annotate these. So if you actually click through, you'll get kind of all the facade methods that are on them. So in my mind, the convenience of being able to kind of command click into that and see these things instead of having to go hunt through the API docs on the web or whatnot, or figure out what the concrete class is through the docs is, in my mind, more powerful. So just an option there. More specifically on facades, though, is facade abuse. So what I want to talk about here is facades are a little bit controversial anyways, but again, as we grok the framework, we use them. It's totally fine. But we can abuse them sometimes. So this is the prime example. Inside of middleware, inside controllers, we're still kind of reaching out and using the request facade, or we're even using the auth facade directly, right? 57% of applications are doing this. So instead of this, though, because of a controller action or because of the handle method inside of middleware, you actually get the request object injected. And because of that, you don't need either one of those facades. You can get the authenticated user off of the request, and you can get, obviously, the request data off the request. So it just lowers that coupling, obviously decreases the complexity. It's a good, kind of pattern. And of course, if you are testing at kind of a unit testing level, this makes it much, much easier to do so in isolation without having to swap out a bunch of facades. All right, queries and views. This is a no-no, but 24% of you are doing this. Tisk, tisk. This should be 0. I'm not going to say anything else about it. Yeah. It's an MVC framework, no. Okay, so API routes. This is kind of another quick example. So Laravel obviously gives you all these different routes that you can put things in, but a lot of people are putting API paths inside of web. Well, sorry, not a lot, it's only 8%, but again, it should be 0, that's a lot in my mind, relatively speaking, but I think around 5.2 or 5.3, Laravel split out these, it gave you a nice, stateless, API out of the box. So if you're truly making API requests, make sure they're not necessarily underneath your, your web middleware, your what is that, middleware group, I guess. Make sure they're truly kind of an API route. If not, they can totally be a web request, but just maybe don't put API in the path. All right, env envy. Thought this was a fun name. What this refers to is configuration caching. So this is something as kind of a speed boost. I think it came about maybe in 5.4. I'm not entirely sure. It's either 5.3 or 5.4. But you can basically cache your configuration. And this is mostly a performance improvement, but it's also actually a little bit helpful when it comes to deployment in case you need to provision a new box or swap out environmental variables underneath. You're not going to affect your application that's running. But 42% of you can't do this. And it's because in your controllers or your views or somewhere, you are referencing env directly. You're using it directly. You need to be referencing through config. That way you're pulling from the cache and you can leverage the cache. So be sure you're doing that. Okay, credit controllers. This is actually a talk that Adam gave last year. Excellent talk. But what I want to kind of focus on here is actually credit controllers. 77% of applications don't follow the resourceful methods as Adam outlined in his talk. So there's some other action that's happening inside of these controllers than the core 7. So what we're talking about here are index, create, store, show, edit, update, destroy, right? They're doing something beyond those. So there's an opportunity here to go back, watch Adam's talk, split things out into multiple controllers, see if you can achieve maybe I guess a little more separation, a little more focus inside of your application. Challenge yourself. This one's actually the worst one in my mind. There's a lot of empty controllers, and by empty I mean they don't contain actions. They contain other things. I don't know what, because I don't have copies of the code, but for some reason they don't have any public actions inside of them, not even an invoke, so they're not even like the single action controller. What I believe is happening here, 26%, that's a lot. What I believe is happening here, though, is, is that people are actually maybe new developers. It's not you guys, I'm sure, but Some people are actually using controllers as an object, and they're calling through to it to do some other piece of behavior that's outside of handling a request. It's something I've seen kind of, again, anecdotally. That's my guess, is that there's some other methods that are happening. Or people are maybe not getting visibility right. Shift is set up to kind of look through for public methods, so maybe you just have everything public when some things should be private if you have these extra helper methods. So something to look at in your applications. Okay, good, we're back on track. Features, all right, so I want to talk a little bit more here about kind of like Laravel features and how maybe we're using them, not using them, or abusing them. Controller validation. So inside of a controller, this is basically where you take the request and you validate it kind of all in line. This is happening 89% of the time. This is huge, huge number. That means pretty much most people are doing it this way. And again, nothing wrong with this when you have a very trim controller. But if you're going through and you're trying to break up like a big block or a long method inside of your controller, there's actually a better way. There's a cool feature inside of Laravel. It's been around for a while. It's called form requests. And form requests allow you to kind of push off all of that complexity, push off all of that code, and now you can even manage the way in which the response is rendered. I think that was available in 5.6. But you can check out the documentation on this. I'm going to steal directly from it, but you can basically take all those rules and kind of push them over to there. And now your controller can be nice and trim and just focused on the action. So form requests. All right. Helpers. Laravel gives you tons and tons of helpers. What I want to focus on specifically are blade directives, because there's a lot of new ones, and I think we've missed them. So a good example are the auth blade directives, right? So instead of doing if auth check or if user or something along those lines, you have auth and you have guest. So you have kind of both sides of that coin. And that keeps your blade templates really nice. I really, kind of goes back to grokking the framework. I really don't like it when inside of my blade template I'm having to like open PHP tags, right? Like I know it's a PHP file and I'm able to do that, but I want to be able to use blade as much as possible. So I think these are pretty valuable. Another good one is JSON. There's just an @JSON blade directive. So instead of calling, again, PHP tags, JSON and code, you can actually dump this straight out. Some that are kind of not in the blade portion of the documentation, but you'll find them in other places of the documentation. If you need to do method spoofing for those whole RESTful controllers we were talking about earlier, you actually have to tack in a hidden field, right? This is kind of the old way to do it. Same with the CSRF token. There we go, yay. Instead of those, this old way, you can actually jump in with some blade directives here. So with put, for example, you can do @method and then @CSRF to get that whole input, hidden input field. Okay, events. We talked earlier about the benefit of using events, but only 19% of applications are using them, so 1 in 5 roughly. There's a lot of events that are listed core inside of the documentation, so a lot of events out of the box, like we saw earlier. A user was authenticated, so you'll get a callback for that, or they logged out, you'll get kind of a callback for that. You can set up a listener. But there's model events that are happening, there's model observers, there's listeners that you can set up, as kind of Adam demonstrated earlier. So if you find an opportunity for these, or a place in which you're looking to kind of put some code and it doesn't feel right, or you want to break up, again, those long blocks, definitely remember to take advantage of events. Okay, Eloquent Relationships. Obviously, 87% of applications are using Eloquent Relationships, but just as a bit more color, I guess, around those, let's go through these a little more slowly. So belongs to, obviously, is the highest one. 87% of applications are using this with an average of 24 relationships per project. So we can go down the line here. We can see that as you start to get into maybe arguably the more advanced relationships like morphing or polymorphic relationships, they kind of feed off, or trickle off a little bit more. So there were less and less of them in the application. So I'll leave that up for just a quick second while I grab a drink. All right. Stats are the next one. Whoops. All right. stats are a good one, and this is actually a package that was out there. I added it on to the Laravel Analyzer. You can install this yourself on any of your projects. I've kind of taken some liberties with its output to make sure that it fit on the slide, but also, I guess, better demonstrate the metrics. But what we have here are basically kind of additional statistics about the usage within applications, the number of classes, the methods per class, as well as lines of code, right? So we see middleware, obviously. The things that come out of the box are always in these applications. I thought it was interesting that controllers was only 67%. I think there's a bug in this package. I want to take a closer look, but I didn't have time. But if we look at the class numbers, these are a little bit more accurate, I think. 20 controllers are the average, 21, I guess, is the average number of controllers. Models, we have 18. But as far as like methods per class and line count, this actually looks pretty good. We'll just scroll down to the bottom here, because I want to focus a little bit on tests. And I actually talk about this, I think, in the next slide. But if we can remember some of these metrics, the unit tests, obviously the ones that come out of the box, are giving us that 100%. But if we actually were to back those out, as I do in the next slide, we'll get some better metrics. But Dusk and BrowserKit aren't super popular. Dusk, obviously more popular. BrowserKit shouldn't be very popular since it's old. But we still see it. It's kind of floating around there. So tests come in at 27%. Only 27% of applications are running tests or have some kind of tests outside the core tests. I think this number could definitely be higher, especially with all the resources and the documentation, all the courses that are out there available on Laracast or Adam's test-driven Laravel. There's all sorts of things that are out there to kind of help you beef up your testing game. So I would definitely encourage you to check that out. Okay, a couple more slides, and then I want to open it up for questions. So the Laravel Analyzer, I mentioned it a few times. What this is I guess, a kind of a micro shift is what I call it. It effectively goes through your application and checks for pretty much all of these things that I just talked about. I made it free last week. It'll continue to be free until the end of this week. So definitely go out and check it out. You can get all of these metrics and kind of see where your application lands. I also have a couple coupons for 20% off, so you can get, I'll leave this up for a second, you can get 20% off any shift, and then base code field guide is something I'm working on to kind of practice some of this clean code. You can get the same 20% discount there, so these will be available for a couple weeks. I'll leave this up for a second, and then I want to open it up for questions. Actually, I'll just leave this up. We'll take questions. I don't know if I can see people out here, but, oh, that's much better. Thank you. All right, I'm going to grab a drink. Anybody have questions on stats or observations or how to write code? Yeah.
Just on that event reflection you're talking about, do you see like applications where you're seeing people that are using a lot of events, how they're handling their events versus
Yeah. Okay, so when we do use events in applications, how are we kind of seeing the folder structure play out? Is that kind of what you're?
No, like you're using lots of events, like you really know that.
Yeah, I see, the other way around.
Yeah, how do you see this in the events providing?
Yeah, okay, so if you have an application that is firing a lot of events, how do you kind of track not only the events that are being fired, like in kind of your mental overhead, but also just where are you registering all of these things, like just all the way in a service provider? I think most people by default are doing them in the service provider. There's opportunity, of course, to do things in models with the dispatch events. Because of those multiple places, though, I agree it's a little disjointed. There's the events service provider. I don't have a problem when that list is very, very large, but maybe it's something as that number improves with events being more widely adopted. Maybe it's something we might end up seeing in the routes folder or something. Maybe just a cleaner place to kind of register those. Not really necessarily a strict answer for you, but I would put it in the event service provider. Is there someone else? Yeah.
Do you have any insight how many Laravel 4 applications are?
Any insight into how many Laravel 4 applications are still out there? No. There's definitely a lot. In fact, Patrick gave a talk, I'm blanking on the last name, I'm not sure if he's here, but their company had something that was still running Laravel 3. So Shift only goes back to 4.2, so that's kind of where my insight stops. I'm still seeing those come across. You know, you would think they wouldn't, but you know, there'll be a few a week that come across, and they'll take it all the way up. So unfortunately, Shift doesn't give me an idea of how many are like out there in the wild any more than like Packages tells you how many times your package is actually being used. Like it'll tell you downloads, but that doesn't really mean anything. So not sure. But there's some that are very old, and they've made the trek. But I think a lot of those older apps are probably just rewriting them from scratch, to be honest. I think there's a couple more. I'll get around. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is duration of time between shifts. So if you're bringing it up multiple versions,
Yeah.
what's an average steps? I mean, is it hours, days? Weeks?
Yeah. So if I run a shift and I got a 5.2 application and I want to go up to 5.6, like how long does it really take me? It depends. I will say a few things on it though. I'll see people that come through and they'll buy the 5.3 shift, 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, and they'll do it in like 15 minutes. And they're just shifting the same shifted branch all the way up. Do not do that. That is a huge mess. I made them separate for a reason because I want you to have that focus and kind of clarity when you're upgrading instead of going from 5.2 to 5.6 and you're like, where did all my auth controllers go? It's just that much harder. So I think you have a lot more context to do that incrementally. I guess on an anecdotal like insight on there, I mean, a lot of the times I'll see people, if it's a small app, it's maybe an hour or two, you know, or 30 minutes even as they get the hang of it. But you can definitely see apps that are longer where it's the next day or the day after or something. So it's definitely achievable. I'm actually got some videos coming out to kind of shift like a pro, so more insights on how to upgrade older applications and just kind of really make the jump faster. Hopefully in the next few weeks when I'm stopping talking and stuff like that. A couple more. You're just gonna have to shout at me because it's like a dead zone over there with light. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a data scientist, and I had a goofy hat on, so I'm not sure if those numbers are 100%. But yes, I know what you're asking. It wasn't necessarily like per view, like per application. It was just like it was kind of very binary. It was if they existed, it was a tally mark against all projects analyzed. So it's definitely on a conservative side. And that one was actually pretty strict. Like I went in, saw what models you have, and then looked for basically that model : : and then some kind of common find by all or where, like not even custom scopes or anything. So there's ways to trick that. So it's definitely on the conservative side, and there's still like a quarter of applications doing that. Two more. Somebody over here I thought I saw? No? Are we all done? Last questions? Yep.
Made it easier to upgrade over time. How's that impacting?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's true, you know, obviously when Taylor kind of touts easiest upgrade ever, I mean, you can, by all means, you can definitely go in and really just run Composer Update and probably be fine for your applications. But sooner or later, the wheels are going to fall off that, and so, you know, as an unbiased, you know, opinion, you could do that totally for probably a couple versions, and it's going to be okay. But obviously, when like Laravel 6 comes out, that's not going to be so easy. So, all right, last question. Who is it? Yes.
How much of it is automated? Do you have to step in and do anything by hand for the shifts?
No, these shifts and 100% automated. There's a human services side where like I will do the shifts for you. A lot of companies, you know, maybe don't have a team or a client that's kind of been abandoned. You know, they'll come do it, or just a company that understands their own value and is just like, we don't want to dedicate resources to this. You do it. Those are the only ones I humanly kind of go in and get access to the repo and change. These other ones are all cloud-based. They run in, as you saw, 200 seconds, and that's it. They're gone. So. All right, I'll gladly take more questions later, but follow me on Twitter for more information, and thank you.